a meeting of the Royal Society of South Africa and a talk which is co-hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa. You can see our logos at the top of Emlyn's slide there. We have with us to talk to us tonight Professor Emlyn Koster, who is the Director Emeritus of the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Alberta, Canada. And you will have read in the introduction to this talk that he is a geoscientist. He focuses on the Anthropocene, and he is going to speak about that this evening. But let me just say one or two things, first of all, about the Royal Society, and just a couple of points to mention. This is one of the talks that we have regularly every month. We have one of our talks, and it is open to members of the Royal Society, and it's also, of course, open to guests of the Royal Society as well, and the Academy. I do want to say that we are very welcoming of new members, and anybody who would like to should go to the website of the Royal Society to take a look at the benefits of being a member. Being a member gives you free access to our journal, the transactions, and invitations to all of these regular meetings, among other things. And I just would like to mention our two latest new members, Dr. Michelle Lochner and Dr. Dimitra Kerenov, who have both recently joined the Royal Society. So I'm going to just continue with a little bit of introduction of our speaker this evening, because one seldom has a CV as interesting as this one, Professor Koster. Professor Koster has a PhD in geology. He also has a qualification from the Graduate School of Business at Harvard, which is on strategic perspectives in non-profit management. He has had a number of different appointments, academic and in, for example, museums. He has been the Director General of the Ontario Science Centre. He has been the President and the CEO of the Institute for Lifelong Learning in Maryland, US, and has also held the role of Director of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. He also has affiliations as an honorary research associate professor at Rutgers University. He's been an adjunct professor in marine, earth, and atmospheric sciences at North Carolina State University. And as I said earlier, he's the Director Emeritus of the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. Professor Koster has a long list of publications, but I thought I would just mention the titles of the last two, the most recent two, which I think speak to what he's going to talk to us about this evening. The first is Optimizing the Anthropocene Definition and this Epistemological View. And then the second one that I wanted to mention is the most recent one, which is Defining the Anthropocene for the Greatest Good as an Event-Based Renaissance. These are amazing titles, and I'm very much looking forward to what you are going to speak about this evening. Let me just conclude by saying that Professor Koster has been the recipient of a number of very eminent awards, not least of which the National Medal for Museum and Library Science and the Chevalier Medal from the one of the academies. I can't actually see it, but one of the academies in France, perhaps you'll tell us. And he is on the Earth Day panel for Johns Hopkins University, and he has been a board member and strategic planning chair for the International Big History Association. Professor Koster, these are fascinating titles and positions, and we're very much looking forward to listening to your talk. So over to you, and at the end of your talk, we will allow a few questions. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Burton, and thank you for tolerating the technical hiccup at the beginning. And to Mike Burton, Mike Bruton, I appreciate the relationship that we've had over the last couple of decades, which have led to this invitation, and to you, Bert, for solving the technical hiccup. So let me take you through the slideshow, which is entitled A Critical Moment in the Continuity of Time. I give an accent in this cover slide to the atmosphere because climate change seems to be such a predominant flavor of discussions about the state and the human influence on the Earth system. But what I've inserted into the view of the atmosphere is the title of a recent paper, A Paradigm Shift to Illuminate This Disrupted Planet. It used to be that we geologists or we non-geologists didn't have to worry about managing the planet. The planet was doing fine by itself, but we do have a problem. And I've been focused on this growing realization for almost 4 decades. As Stephanie mentioned, I come from being a geologist to begin with, having been in the mid-90s the president of the Geological Association of Canada with a presidential address entitled The Human Journey in the Evolving Museum. But wrapped around that mid-90s point, from 1991 through 2018, I've been at the helm of 4 major nature and science museums, and you can see them there. They've all been glorious structures, and they've had these missions up to and including illuminate the natural world and inspire its conservation. So with that as a backdrop, I've switched my interest in the last few years to the matters of the Anthropocene, also pronounced as the Anthropocene, but I have a personal preference for the Anthropocene pronunciation, because after all, we say anthropology, anthropogenic, anthropomorphic, but in Britain, it seems to be that the preference pronunciation is Anthropocene. So I think either are fine, and I'm trying to guide a consistency of a fundamental term. But at any rate, the term comes into being, as I'll mention in a few slides, back in the early part of this century. And quite soon, there are books out there inquiring about, rhetorically, what legacy will humans leave on the surface of the planet? And that same author in 2010, as you can see, was venturing, along with other authors, that the Anthropocene represents a new phase in both humankind and of the Earth, where natural forces and human forces become intertwined, so the future of one determines the fate of the other. That's sort of a paradigm shift, to say the least. And so we can go forward to 2016 in what I think is still a very influential paper, not fully appreciated. Simon Dolby, a colleague in Canada, writing in the Anthropocene Review, says that then, and this still applies, that this term is a key theme in contemporary speculations about the meaning of the present and the possibilities of the future. He asks how the Anthropocene is interpreted and who gets to invoke which framing of the new human age matters greatly for both the planet and for particular parts of humanity. Those particular parts, as you might guess, happen to be those that are less well off and clinging on to life because of reasons way beyond the state of the planet. But I'd like to go back to 225 years ago, because the thinking that the world so urgently needs, in my view, was actually came in a prescient way from that famous polymath explorer, Alexander von Humboldt, who in the first decade of the 1800s was beginning to put things together. And so his biography, his fusion of science and humanism, is the title of a paper in the AAAS Science magazine in 2019. And Stephen Jackson writes, the Anthropocene discussion focuses attention on a fundamentally Humboldtian observation that humanity and nature are deeply intertwined, and that nature would persist in the absence of humanity, but that humanity cannot exist without nature. We have a hard job in planet Earth coming to terms with that reality. Having talked about museums, I've followed what's been happening in terms of the portrayal of the Anthropocene in museums. And certainly the first exhibition, as you can see on the left, was at the Deutsche Museum in Munich, Germany, back in 2014. And it lasted for almost 2-3 years. And I would say, and I've written, that it had the unfortunate title of Welcome, Welcome to the Anthropocene, the Earth in Our Hands. Well, it's true that the Earth is in our hands, but I'm not sure that welcome was the right sentiment. And so fast forward, as it says on the balance of this slide, just a couple of years ago in the journal Museum and Society, which is published by the University of Leicester in the UK, these authors from Denmark are suggesting that it's time for a new key word in the museum, the Anthropocene. But they note, somewhat elaborating on what I just said about that Deutsche Museum exhibition 5 years before, most exhibitions in fact appear to deliberately exclude significant controversies about the Anthropocene and the predicament of the world from their arenas for reflection. So the museum field is flagging a problem, and it's the one that I've been focused on. So we need to open up the lens of time and look at sort of the phenomenal 4.6 billion years of Earth history since the Big Bang and the formation of the solar system. And a summary of that is on the right. We're living in the Phanerozoic, but in more detail, we're living in the top slice of the Phanerozoic in the Quaternary period and in the post-Holocene epoch. And the question is, what are we in geologically, and to what extent does it matter to the geological timescale when so much has happened in the last few hundred years, the last few thousand years? So I sort of take the mind, if I may, to that top right-hand image of here we are, supposedly the most intelligent thing that's ever walked the surface of the planet. And we need to look at a 100-year time frame with this year, 2023, as being, as I said, a critical moment in the continuity of time. But I'm going to just take you on a quick hitchhiker's journey from 1950 to 2050 to enclose what I feel is this pivotal moment that's going to involve the United Nations. And so in 1950, the British astronomer, Sir Fred Hoyle, said in a book that quite prophetically, once a photograph of the Earth taken from the outside, that was not imaginable when that would occur in 1950, which happens to be the year I was born. Once that photo is available, he projected that a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. Well, that was correct, but he couldn't know when. So in '68, we got when we were having a fly past the moon in preparation for going to land on the moon, we had this Earthrise photograph. In '69, we landed on the moon, and the astronauts said, "One giant leap for humankind." And then in 1972, in another Apollo mission, we actually had a full-scale look at what is called the Blue Marble, maybe one of the most iconic, most well-known photographs of the Earth. So, 22 years from Fred Hoyle's prediction to actually, that's the photo of the Earth taken from the outside. And it did unleash new ideas in history, but not as fast and not as much as I think should have occurred. NASA, until '72, was not interested in photography of the Earth. They were interested in beating the Russians at space technology. At least in 1970, the first Earth Day occurred, and there's the front page of the New York Times. Millions joined Earth Day observations across the nation. Well, in fact, it was around the globe. But let's leap forward to the middle '80s, and this may be history that some of you on this webinar today, were alive at this point. I was 35, and we have the Norwegian Prime Minister, Brundtland, being asked by the United Nations to head up a commission, and there she is in the lower left slide. And it led to the book called Our Common Future, the World Commission on Environment and Development, which is sort of an oxymoron of terms, isn't it? Environment and development. But if we fast forward, the term sustainability, which is so rampant and so, I think, ill-used in today's world, there's very little that we're doing which is actually sustainable. We certainly can't reverse the things that we've changed, like extinction of so much of the biosphere, or plastics in the ocean, or changing climate. And so I'll go along with what Andy Revkin, a former New York Times science reporter, said in 2022. He's at the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York. Sustainability, he feels, is one of the most overused and ill-defined words in conversations about the environment, and yet we keep on using it. So let's go to 2002, and this is a day I had in my, or a year I had in my earlier calendar. That's the eminent Nobel laureate atmospheric chemist, Paul Crutzen, who died last year, who published this one-page paper called Geology of Humankind in Nature, maybe one of the most quoted one-page papers in Nature that I think may exist. Out of that one-page paper, in the last paragraph, he said that he felt that this proposal of the Anthropocene, which he said we are now living in, but his best ideas, this is now 21 years ago in 2002, and I'll just call out the red highlighted ones. He said, and quite true, he said, a daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society, and that this will require appropriate human behavior on all scales. Well, how right he was, and how right he is, and how right he continues to be, because we are stuck in this mode, ladies and gentlemen, and that's what I'd like to sort of take you into in the balance of this talk. So the United Nations, which typically aren't combined with geological thinking, but I found it necessary to do so, that's the front cover of the 2015 publication called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So here's the Brundtland Commission term, sustainable development, still alive and well, unfortunately, as I'll hope to show you. And what it said back in 2015, very optimistically, and may I read, this is the words in the preface from the Secretary General of the United Nations. We resolve between now, 2015, 7 years ago, and 2030, to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and in particular for this talk in red, to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. All right, so, and we pledge to create conditions, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm afraid none of that has really come true. And we have a problem in 2023, which is why I call this a critical moment in the continuity of time. This diagram is well known, and it's the display of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You'll notice that they start with culture, dealing with things like poverty and hunger, and end up with, in 14, 15, and 13, dealing with climate and life below water and life above land. And they throw in partnerships for the goals in number 17. The reason for that order is because the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 were preceded by the 9 Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000. That was the optimism of the United Nations then. That's 23 years ago. And they weren't thinking about nature. They were only talking about what is still the terrible state of the human journey on the planet, let alone the natural world. So this is sort of the background. And moving closer to the present, as I continue sort of this journey with you, let's pick up the relatively new International Science Council, which is a new body, the topmost body for the social sciences and the sciences in the world. And what they said in 2020 was that, quite accurately, in a preface to a launch of a project called the Human Development Project, the Next Frontier, very propitious title, but the first time in a relationship spanning 300,000 years, that goes back into the middle of the Ice Age, instead of the planet shaping humans, humans are shaping the planet. This is the Anthropocene, the age of humans. Well, fast forward only 2 years, and someone I'm now in touch with who spoke, who's the incoming vice president for the International Science Council, Motoko Katani from Japan, a mathematician. She said, having experienced the terrible tsunami and earthquake on the coast of Japan 10 years ago, she writes about that very emotively. she says the great challenge is for basic science and society to transcend the invisible barriers and to co-create a new vision of the Earth human system, not just the Earth system, but the Earth human system in an integrated manner. Well, let's go to the Earth human system. And as a geologist since the 60s, you know, the geology that I was trained was the rocks below the Earth's surface. So we can look at the canyon lands of the Western US. Geology, the name, which was the scientific study of the solid Earth, gave way to the Earth sciences, a broader view in which we were starting to be as interested in the ocean and what lay below the ocean in terms of plate tectonics and seafloor spreading in the late 60s. In the 1970s, sort of considered a little wacky, but I would say very true today. We don't have to call it the Gaia hypothesis, but certainly the two authors, James Lovelock, who lived to 102 and died last year, the inventor of the term biodiversity, and his colleague Lynn Margulis, they said they recognized in the 70s, and this needs to be, I think, sort of approached today, that the Earth is actually a self-regulating series of ecosystems composing a single huge ecosystem above, at, and just below the Earth's surface. And it comprises, you know, these 6 major shells, which I'm showing on the right, in downward order: the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and then the cryosphere with the inset of the tundra, glaciers, ice sheets, and tundra, the biosphere, the humanosphere with its inset on the virosphere, which brought us the pandemic, and the lithosphere with its inset on the pedosphere, which is the soil sphere. These are the interacting subsystems. And when we talk about climate change, we do ourselves a misfavor by just talking about climate in isolation from the other factors. So let me illustrate the most telling example of that, although let me do so via the growing focus that we have in thinking about things called existential crises. You know, back before 2019, when dictionary.com introduced this term as a new word, they introduced existential, I should say, not with its crisis, but prior to the 2020 and the pandemic, the definition of existential crisis was very much on a personal, individual scale, a moment of deep questioning within oneself on how someone sees themselves and their purpose within the world. In early 2020, for reasons of autocracies and climate change and the pandemic, we suddenly took this term into a global sense, and the news was full of what it says here: accelerating, sudden, preoccupying, news-dominating issues that have destabilized social and environmental norms. That's the world we're in now. So the link between those subsystems in the Earth human system is, as Elizabeth Rush says in the magazine Anthropocene 3 years ago, like it or not, retreat from the coast has begun. The question is left is whether it will be managed or chaotic. Well, there's Lower Manhattan, and I continue to advise the thinking, maybe it's impossible advice, but already in Superstorm Sandy 10 years ago, we saw what the combination of a 13-foot storm surge at high tide and big winds did to inundate the rim of Lower Manhattan and fill the tunnels across the Hudson River and the subway lines. And so that article was covered in that magazine that I show in the lower right. And here's sort of a schematic which shows where sea level is going. And just yesterday or today, with the news in the world that we're likely to exceed the 1.5 centigrade climate warming and all of the attendant issues, it's sort of here and now, isn't it? So back to the United Nations, and there's that report written 7 years ago. Again, we're at the midpoint, a critical juncture in the continuity of time. What we have now just written 2 months ago, or actually this month, is, and I read, if I may, it's time, in a report titled Toward a Rescue Plan for People and Planet, it's time to sound the alarm. At the midpoint of our way to 2030, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are in deep trouble. a preliminary assessment of the approximately 140 targets with data show only 12% are on track. Close to half, although showing progress, are moderately or severely off track, and some 30% have either seen no movement or regressed below their beginning level. And then they highlight, if ever there was an illumination of the short-sightedness of our prevailing economic and political systems, it is the ratcheting up on the war on nature. And I could go on, but I think the point is clear. So what we have in 2023 is a situation with two possible outcomes. But across the top of the slide, if you're not familiar with it, every time the geological profession adds a new layer formally to the geologic timescale, you know, the one that gives us terms like Cretaceous and Jurassic and Cambrian and Pleistocene, it goes through a rigorous four-stage process. Each of those new potential names, terms, is given starts with a working group. Well, right now, since 2009, we've had the Anthropocene Working Group, and that reports to a subcommission of the unit to which the Anthropocene may become a part, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy. The Quaternary is the last couple of million years of Earth history, which in turn reports to the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which comprises all the chairs of all the subcommissions, and that body reports to the topmost body in the world, the IUGS, which is the International Geological Sciences. And when Dr. Burton read the title of one of my recent papers, Optimizing the Definition of the Anthropocene, that was co-written with colleagues from Cambridge University and University College London in the journal Episodes of the International Union of Geological Sciences. I'm very anxious to try and swing the thinking towards the second of these two options below. The Anthropocene Working Group is fixated on the mid-20th century, a terrible time in Earth history when we tested atomic bombs. And so, like at the end of the Cretaceous, when an asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula and changed climates, and below which there were dinosaurs and above which there were no dinosaurs, we have that group sticking to its stratigraphic mentality and saying that the golden spike, so-called, for the Anthropocene should be the mid-20th century, and that we should start a new epoch called the Anthropocene epoch. The status of that sequence of protocols across the top is that right now, in the next couple of months, the Anthropocene Working Group is going to be recommending to the next layer that they recommend this approach. It looks like that anyway. Whereas the paper that's written by my colleague Phil Gibbard from Cambridge and others in the last year has recommended a different approach, and one that I very much support. And that is that that's not a useful thing for the public. It may be fascinating geologically or geochemically, but I've also written that I don't think we need to remember what terribly is still a threat to the world through Russia and North Korea and so on, and other countries that are still testing atomic bombs. What we need is a much more constructive, holistic, transdisciplinary approach. And so the term Anthropocene event is a long-term look at how humanity is, as it says here, extensively detached itself from the natural functioning of the Earth human system. It continues to do so, and so that iconic image to the right, to the left, is showing the clocks of time continuing into the future without a particular reference to the atomic bomb testing of the mid-20th century. I think this is why I'm saying we are at a critical moment in the continuity of time. This diagram, which contains details beyond what we can cover today, is from Phil Gibbard's 2220 article entitled A Practical Solution, the Anthropocene as an Event, Not an Epoch. But I'll just draw you to the main layers. So look at the top. It says Pleistocene epoch, Holocene epoch. We're right now in the Holocene epoch, and you can see above the right-hand end, just after the Second World War, and in fact the beginning of the United Nations, the first resolution of the United Nations in London that we should never again, as Einstein warned, fiddle around with things like atomic testing. And so the Anthropocene event in this view is one that overlaps, going back to the beginnings of human evolution and human impacts. We've been farming and altering rivers and altering landscapes and altering coastlines for a very long time. It's much more recent that we've been extinguishing other wildlife and changing climates and dropping plastic everywhere. But that's the point of this diagram, is to confront these two ideologies and come out with a conclusion that we need to recognize the Anthropocene event. So as I move to the end of this presentation, going back to 2012, when I was in the midst or the latter half of my museum, Nature and Science Museum career, and there was a major symposium at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., that convened 100 or so leaders of natural history museums from around the world. And I was part of the conference declaration writing team, in which our declaration said, and I would say the same thing now, we have the urgent responsibility to give voice to the Earth's immense story. We are at a critical moment in the continuity of time. And that picture shows the rise and the fall of the sun above the Arctic, which is sort of a conveyance of how we really got to be focused on time in a way that we aren't. And as Greta Thunberg says, the leaders are not in the room, which is why I'm trying to link things with the United Nations. So moving to the last few slides, I just want to recall that I've said two things in publications, one back in 2011 in the journal Geoscientist of the JOLSOC of London. And my projection back, this is 12 years ago, was that geology uniquely brings big time and space perspectives to the planning table as an essential frame of reference. It wasn't doing it then, and it still isn't doing it. And I projected that the Anthropocene represents geology's best chance to take its rightful place as a core contributor. And this next phrase is not mine, it's Aristotle's from 3,000 years ago. He said that leadership should be about the harmonious pursuit of positive consequences in the world. I've added multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. A year ago, I wrote in Episodes, the Journal of the International Union of Geological Sciences, I said, today it does not seem premature to conclude that the Anthropocene, with all that this term can usefully encompass, looms as the most consequential alteration in the course of history, just like Fred Hoyle said in 1950. So we end with the United Nations. There's a picture of the Rio summit in 1982 on the environment and development. The lower right shows an iconic image of the movement of an activist side of society called Just Earth, looking at people and planet and one future. What I think the world needs to do is have a much more seamless view of past, present, future, of the sciences and the humanities, and of the environments and societies of nature and culture. So I'm trying to move things along, and I'm speaking at World Environment Day on June the 5th with the same title as I brought to you today. And also I'm speaking on Friday to a senior official of the SDGs of the UN in New York. And I believe that what the world needs in the wake of the failed SDG agenda from 2015 to 2030, at least through 2050, 100 years since Fred Hoyle said, we need that photo of the Earth from the outside, is an Anthropocene renaissance that integrates nature and culture and fuses thinking, which is currently very disparate and fragmented. And so time also to integrate indigenous customs, and I will not go into the details here, but there's two major North American tribes, the Iroquois and the Dakota, who recommend in their own culture, and they give us an exemplar of this thinking, that we should be good ancestors with a 7th-generation mindset. And some of those features below are sort of aphorisms or aspects of the way they conduct themselves. And I'm grateful that we seem to have a new respect and involvement for indigenous people. They need to be at this table, and they have hardly played a role in the SDGs over the last 7 years. So here we are, the United Nations, 2 years ago, it met for Rio +50 in Stockholm. Last year, it started to count down to the SDG summit, which is this September in 2023. And the planning is now for the summit of the future in New York City at the UN headquarters in September in 24. And you can see slides that are preparing for that. I think it's high time that all of us, had a go at trying to influence the considerations here. Let me see if I can exit my slideshow. I don't want to stop sharing. Maybe I do, but I'll come back to you now. So that's my presentation, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you so much, Emlyn. And amazing. I think everybody will have been really blown away by what you've had to say in a very concise and clear way. Some very strong messages there. And I'm sure there will be some questions or comments from the audience. So can I invite them to anybody who would like to make a comment or ask a question you can use your hand, your electronic virtual hand on the Zoom platform to ask or make a comment. Anybody? Everybody always takes a moment to think about this. Okay, let's ask Patricia Whitelock.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'm just interested in what your perception is about the African reaction to that in particular, and perhaps the reaction of the scientists within South Africa in particular. Are these groups with whom you have discussed this?
Well, thank you, Patricia. That may be a next avenue for me, because courtesy of Mike Bruton, it was just yesterday that I spoke with Johan Kruger of the Leadership for Conservation in Africa, which was a delight not only to do this today in Cape Town with you, but to speak to Johannesburg yesterday, because you may have seen in my bio that I was actually born in Africa, although the very northeast corner of it in the Suez Canal zone. And so I actually, feel a lot of affinity for the importance of your continent participating in this. And so I will know more, but I've just been invited to address the Leadership for Conservation in Africa on July the 7th, I think. So more to follow, but I'm delighted to have these connections. Mike Bruton knows that because we both were involved in a new UNESCO project called The Language of the Anthropocene, which did try to involve some sub-Saharan countries, in particular Kenya. So Mike, I might turn to you for, you have maybe a more detailed in Africa perception of whether this is gaining traction or not. Can I refer back to you?
Yeah, Stephanie, if I may comment, there's certainly is a feeling among African scientists that we have been left out of the process and that we should be more involved, and I believe have a lot to contribute. Not only, through cutting edge science, but also through indigenous knowledge systems. And I think, through those online programs, there is a voice being developed, which is now being heard internationally. And I believe that's extremely important. But if I may make two comments, firstly, I agree that that NASA photograph of planet Earth was a major step forward in our realization of the fragility of our planet. But I also think that magical image called the pale blue dot, which I think was taken by Voyager 1 from several million miles away, was also quite an eye-opener, what a tiny little dot we live on. And in terms of past publications, I think one that's ignored and which I think was hugely influential at the time was the World Conservation Strategy published in 1970 by the IUCN and its collaborators, because that very, very clearly set out the importance of essential ecological processes and life support systems. And, I think it has been ignored at our cost. the question I'd like to put to Emlyn is, this is a major extinction event. There's no doubt about it. But to me, the importance of it is that it's the first one caused by a living organism, an animal, us. Whereas all the others were carried out, through cataclysmic physical events. How do you think the nature of the extinction event will differ, having been caused by a living organism?
Right. Well, this was, of course, the written about in the book called The Sixth Extinction about 4 or 5 years ago. That's us. The previous 5, as you say, Mike, were all, as it were, naturally caused by pre-human situations on the planet. The thing that I think maybe needs to be added to the understanding of this one, the 6th extinction, anthropogenically caused, is that it's all occurring in a sort of almost a literal nanosecond of Earth history. All the changes that we're referring to in the Anthropocene are at a scale which is impossible to isolate in the scale of the Earth's 4.6 billion year history, or even in the scale of the 2 million period long Quaternary epoch, the one that contains the Ice Age and the Anthropocene. So we're talking about a pace of change, whether it's any of our pollution impacts or extinction causes that are below the resolution of what we can even ascertain to have been the cause of extinctions in the past. With the possible exception of the asteroid hit one day, one night maybe, around 64.5 million years ago, 64.9 million years ago, in Yucatan, when an asteroid, which could reoccur, they're out there in the solar system, hit the surface of the Earth and caused a mass natural extinction. That was probably instantaneous, even in human geological terms. So I think your question is one that the world needs to confront, because the loss of biodiversity, which has been catalogued, we're the only surviving species, sapiens, of the genus Homo. If we go back just a few tens of thousands of years, as many of you know, out of Africa in particular, there were other concurrent species of the genus Homo. We seem to have done all those in, and here we are left as the architect of some serious damage, unsustainable, irreversible damage to the rest of the biosphere. So I think your question poses a major need, and I wish that school education, and I wish the United Nations were able to focus much more broadly, not just on climate change, although that is a entree into the dilemma, but we need an Earth-human system approach, like the new incoming president of the International Science Council, Motoko Katani, has recommended, and I hope she pursues this level of thinking.
Yeah, Stephanie, maybe we could give Bruce Rubich a chance. He had his hand up. Be very interesting to hear what his comment is.
Bruce, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand, and I still don't see it, but yes, please go ahead. And then David Scarf, I see you as well.
No, I didn't mean to put my hand up. I was actually just giving a big clap because I thought it was a fantastic lecture. But I'm in the process of developing a big paleontological exhibit in the Karoo. And one of the things that I want to show is past extinction events and then the current extinction event. And that's why I'm so intrigued by this lecture, because I'm trying to think of ways to show up what's currently going on in terms of damaging to the ecosystems and the Earth. And so I'm very intrigued by this talk, Emlyn. And I was really very, when I visited the Tyrrell Museum a couple of years ago, I looked at that model and I thought that's a fantastic model to try and emulate in the Karoo, where there's a wealth of fossils as well.
Well, Bruce, I'm delighted to know that you visited the Tyrrell Museum. Let me ask you to get in touch with me. I'd love to know more about what you're planning in this exhibit. So koster.emlyn@gmail.com is my email address, or you can find me through LinkedIn. But I'd love to get into a dialogue with you and exchange news and views about how to portray natural and anthropogenic extinctions.
Thank you. That'll be very useful. I certainly will do that.
Thank you. David, do you have your hand up? David Scarth?
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Emlyn, I was rather impressed with your dynamic thinking here and integrating different ideas. I'm at this same age as you. And one of the things that I am now involved with is some of the issues about essentially feeding the world. But it all comes back to environmental aspects, and perhaps the most important is population size. The bottom line that I'm aiming at here is population, even though we can theorize or put in some ideas of controlling human population size so we don't exceed the true carrying capacity of the Earth. And that's very controversial and different ways to approach it. It comes back to the same one single thing, at least for me. Arguably, the critical issue here is exceeding carrying capacity of the Earth. And I would say arguably every single one of the problems that we throw out today, whether it be climate change or any of the other things, simply comes back to that population size. The issue here that we're all looking for is a solution. If we use good biological information and understand concepts of population control, we arrive at very simply, there are only two ways to control population size. It's through death rate and birth rate. However, globally, society almost refuses to address either of these issues. So my really question here is how can those issues be introduced into some of the dialogue in terms of sustainability? Because there is absolutely no way that the Earth can sustain this total continuation of population growth. I'll also just add a comment here. I'm deeply involved in medicine, and one of the issues within medicine or that has emerged and is gaining a lot of attention is what we refer to the One Health concept. And it's almost similar to what you are presenting here, where human health, animal health, and environmental health are so intertwined, you cannot separate one from the other. Now, where that will go in the next decade, who knows? But I'd love to hear your opinions on this issue of population growth and how it can be controlled.
Thank you very much. So I guess I'll just begin by the last point you made. I think back in 2015, Lancet, the oldest medical journal, partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation in New York to look at planetary health. In fact, that was the title of their paper in the journal Lancet. And what they concluded was what you just summarized, which is that the human health and environmental health are absolutely intertwined and inseparable, except that as was said way back in one of my earlier slides and was recognized 225 years ago by Alexander von Humboldt, although maybe he didn't say this, but the biography of his philosophy certainly says this, is that humans can exist without nature, but nature can exist without humans, but humans can't exist without nature. So, right. We can slice and dice that matter many different ways. I would agree that human population growth has been a major exacerbant, but I would also say that, in my view, respectfully, that it's human attitudes, not just human population, which have been the major problem. And with so much of the world, 7, 8, 9 billion, wherever we are now, below poverty and living in subsistence, and the other end of the world living in excessive luxury, that we have a problem in diversity of that nature. I read that we're trying to we're now up to 2 or 3 planet capacities, and even when the Brundtland Commission did its thing in the mid-80s, we already passed the carrying capacity of the planet then, even though it was rather naively thought by that commission that the definition of sustainability should be that we shouldn't consume more in the future than we do now, so as to preserve resources for future generations. I'm afraid that was, to quote the phrase, almost dead on arrival, because we were already past that kind of consumption level. So I think that the value of what is being recommended now is an Earth-human system and a holistic renaissance is that sustainable development hasn't shown itself to be a feasible 17-silo approach to solving very much on the Earth, as is now being recognized in a crisis way by the United Nations. So it's going to be, to say the least, interesting, but actually quite very concerning to see how the UN, which is the world's only Earth management body, but for better or worse, manages its way through the next 7 years to 2030, the end of its so-called agenda for the future, and what they do to give a guidance to the planet, people and nature in the next period. That's where I'm recommending that we need a new paradigm of a holistic renaissance. I hope that approaches some of the points you were raising, David.
Thank you. We're nearly at the end of our time, but let me just read out or explain to you a question which was put in the chat by Karen Esler, who is an academic, and asks a question about universities and saying when we talk about future science and present and future science and humanities as a fusion, it suggests that we should structure our universities and offerings differently. And the question is, what do you think that we could be doing at university level in terms of transdisciplinary work, doctoral studies, and so on, and also at undergraduate level? I don't know to what extent you would like to comment on that, but I was also wanting to ask a similar question, and that is, how should we be changing the way in which we educate the broad population?
Well, Stephanie, thank you. I mean, that's a very broad and very, very fundamental question. And I'm driven just to answer it in as briefly as I can by citing what I experienced in Costa Rica as a completely different approach to what a university is. It actually has the acronym EARTH, but it doesn't stand for the planet. Earth is equatorial, A is agricultural, T is tropical, and I forget the other words. I was a guest of it and gave a lecture back around 2000 when my talk was entitled The Social Uptake of Science. I was a guest of National Science and Technology Week in Costa Rica. This is a country, of course, that is very much to be admired. It houses the UN's University for Peace. It gave up its military spending and put it all into education. It's the world's leader at ecotourism thinking. But I go back to that university because that university, to your question, and maybe there are others, but I don't know of them, only has one subject, and that is agriculture in the equatorial zone. That's all they do. And it was fascinating to experience the campus situation because all of the amenities and facilities and courses were all wrapped around that. And they have this novel approach that each spring the faculty fan out around the equator and find students that are not likely to go to university based on their current resources. They search and find and bring students and bring them together in Costa Rica to have this undergraduate experience. So I find that very progressive, and I find the University for Peace, which is just outside the capital, San Jose, which I'm increasingly knowing about. I would say these are two exemplars, may I say, of alternatives to the, may I say, the traditional, typical, multidisciplinary, multi-collegial, multi-department, encyclopedic universities, which may give some attention to what I've been talking about, but are not organized to give it the attention it needs.
Thank you. I think there are a number of us who puzzle with that all the time. I would like to ask a last question, and I'm using President's privilege here to do it. I spent the last few days at a meeting between the International Science Council Board and the Inter Academies Partnership Board, which was fascinating, and Tomoko was there. But we had a discussion around trust in science and the extent to which the general population trusts what scientists say. And I wanted to ask your comment on the extent to which you encounter trust or not trust in the kind of evidence and the kind of information that you are providing, and how you think we should be dealing with any mistrust of the science that we are reporting.
Well, again, your question is so broad, if I may, Stephanie. I'd love to, take that to a few other circuits with you if we can get in touch about that. I mean, I think there's a real problem embedded in the premise of your question is that, do we have trust? Do we have non-trust? Do we have a disinterest in trust? I'm going to my answer is going to be, in the interest of brevity, is to say, and I'm guilty probably of generalization or simplification, but certainly from the universities that I have had close association with, both as a faculty member and as an adjunct, and they've all been, I should say, in the US and Canada. So let me say, with all those caveats, I feel that the departments in science are so extensively occupied by brilliant minds who have had little or no contact with the real world. They did their PhDs on some aspect of a science. They qualified in an interview process to be, the best next appointment in whatever field. They teach in that field. They apply for grants in that field. They do their thing, and they go through their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they never really. And again, I'm excusing my generalization. There are clearly exceptions, but in general, the problem is that so few scientists actually develop a holistic view, and so we are lacking minds in enough quantity in enough different areas to be able to wrap our arms around the big picture. We're deep into specificity rather than generalizations, and I think the world needs the big picture, not more micro specific endeavors. Of course, ultimately, science proceeds on both of those scales, but so much of the energy and the effort and the focus of associations, of departments, of researchers, again, with apology if I've been overly generalizing here, but I'm trying to answer your question honestly. I think the problem is that this problem is with scientists.
Thank you.
Would you agree, if I may ask, if I could flip the question?
Well, I take a slightly different view, because my experience over the last few years has been extensively in science communication, and particularly writing national reports and so on, and receiving a great deal of information about community mistrust in science, not necessarily about sustainability or climate change only, but in general, of course, with the COVID pandemic. I have experienced and been on the receiving end of a lot of skepticism from communities. So I think it's one of the big conversations that we should be having as I want to say, a transdisciplinary population of scientists. I think being transdisciplinary is actually one of the keys. But my view is that we have the responsibility around winning the trust of the broadest society, because if we don't, we won't be able to convince them of new steps that need to be taken in many different areas.
Well, so
That's
can
a
I
view.
just,
That's a personal appointment.
no, well,
Of course,
I
my opinion.
thank you for sharing that. Can I just respond back, if I may, taking a minute?
Mm.
I probably should have added, in pointing the finger to the narrow-mindedness of so much of the scientific endeavor. You know, the problem that you're highlighting is the need, the pressing, huge scale need for science to communicate more effectively with the public at large. And so your experience at the level of reports, you know, at the national discipline level, I think probably has, you know, brought out of the woodwork great examples of where science is doing the right thing. It's a matter of relative emphasis, but I think that, you know, the general literacy of the public in science, which used to be naively true-false questions like, did humans coexist with dinosaurs, needs to be much more now about nuanced science and society issues. And so again, I'd love to talk to you more about that aspect of it.
Well, I'll look forward to that conversation. I would really like to take that further as well. In fact, I think it's one of the directions in which we will take the Royal Society of South Africa. I am going to draw this to a conclusion now. I think that we've had an absolutely fascinating discussion and your presentation, and I would like to say thank you very much indeed for the clarity with which you presented it, and the depth and the importance of what you have had to say to us this evening. I would indeed like to take this further, and maybe we can arrange a further discussion at some stage with more other members of the Royal Society. Colleagues, let me just say thank you very much to all of you for attending as well, and a special thank you to Mike for introducing us to Professor Koster and suggesting that we have this evening's talk. So thank you everybody for joining us. As I say, this is a conversation that we will continue. Thank you very much indeed, Emlyn, for your presentation and for some very thought-provoking ideas. And let me wish you all a good evening.
My pleasure. Thanks very much. Thanks for your interest, and thank you very much.
Thank you.